For most of that year, the Wales family had almost disappeared from public life. No garden parties, no school runs caught on camera, no wave from a car window. For a family that the whole world was used to watching, the silence was strange. And it was that silence that made people pay attention. Because when Kate Middleton, the Princess of Wales, finally did step back into the light on a cold December evening, millions of eyes were waiting. What they saw was not just a princess in a red coat. It was a mother walking into a church with her husband and 3 children beside her, after a year that had tested her in ways very few people ever have to face. This is the story of that evening, the return of a family to public view, the small gestures that carried enormous weight, and the quiet way a father stood beside his wife and children when it mattered most. The year had begun normally enough. Then in the early months of 2024, everything changed. Kate went into hospital for planned abdominal surgery. At first, the public was told it was a private medical matter, nothing more, but weeks passed and she did not appear. Speculation grew. Then in March, Kate recorded a video message that she shared herself, speaking directly to camera. She explained that tests taken after her surgery had found cancer, and that she had begun a course of preventative chemotherapy. It was one of the most personal moments any senior royal had ever shared with the public, and it changed the tone of the entire year that followed. From that point on, Kate mostly stayed away from public duties. She was seen only a handful of times, a brief appearance at Trooping the Colour in June, a visit to Wimbledon in July to watch the tennis she loved. Each appearance was treated as a small victory, a sign that she was still fighting, still present, even if she could not yet return to her full public role. Prince William, meanwhile, carried on. He continued his royal duties, his environmental projects, his visits and engagements, all while managing something few people ever see. A family quietly holding itself together during a health crisis, away from cameras, in the ordinary rooms of their home in Windsor. Their 3 children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, were, for the most part, kept away from the public entirely during this period. Their parents had always tried to protect them from the intensity of royal life, and during a year like this, that instinct became even stronger. School runs happened quietly. Weekends were kept private. If the children felt the weight of what their mother was going through, the world was not shown it. What the world was shown, instead, was a family choosing privacy over performance, even while living one of the most public lives on Earth. Then in September 2024, Kate shared another video. This one had a different tone. She announced that she had completed her course of chemotherapy. She spoke about how the months had been the hardest of her life, and how she was now focusing on recovery, on being present for her family, on taking things step by step. She did not promise an immediate full return to public duties. She was careful, measured, realistic. But for a country that had been watching and waiting, it was the first real sign of hope in a difficult year. Even after that announcement, the family did not rush back into the spotlight. There was no grand re-entrance planned, no single dramatic appearance meant to mark a turning point. Instead, the return happened gradually, quietly, the way real recovery often does. A visit here, a short public moment there. It was in this atmosphere, cautious hope, mixed with the memory of how hard the year had been, that Kensington Palace made an announcement in November. Kate would host her annual Christmas Carol service again this year, at Westminster Abbey on Friday, December 6th. For most people, a carol service might sound like a small thing, but this one was different because of what it represented. Kate had started the Together at Christmas service years earlier, as a way to bring people together at the end of the year and to honor ordinary individuals who had shown extraordinary kindness in their communities. Nurses, volunteers, teachers, neighbors, the kind of people who rarely get thanked publicly for what they do. The service had quickly become one of the most personal projects Kate had ever led, something that was entirely her own creation rather than a traditional royal duty passed down through generations. That she was choosing this event, of all events, to make her most significant public return since finishing chemotherapy, said something. It was not a return to duty for duty's sake. It was a return to something she had built herself, something that mattered to her personally. And this year, there was another layer to it. For the first time since Kate's diagnosis had become public, all 3 of her children were expected to join her and William at the service. George, Charlotte, and Louis had occasionally appeared at family events before Wimbledon, church services, the occasional public outing. But this would be their first appearance together as a full family unit since the year had turned so difficult. In a household that had worked so hard to shield its children from public scrutiny during a medical crisis, the decision to bring all three of them to Westminster Abbey was, in its own quiet way, significant. News of the upcoming service spread quickly once Kensington Palace confirmed it. Royal commentators, who had spent the year cautiously tracking Kate's recovery through her rare public appearances, described the carol service as a milestone moment, not because of anything dramatic that was expected to happen, but because of what her simple presence there would mean. A princess who had spent a year fighting cancer, largely out of public view, was choosing to stand in front of over 1,000 guests and a television audience of millions, in the very same church where she had married William more than a decade earlier. There was another detail that added weight to the moment. Westminster Abbey was not just any building. It was the place where William and Kate had exchanged their wedding vows in 2011, the place where generations of British royals had been crowned, married, and mourned. For Kate to choose this specific location, for this specific service, in this specific year, gave the event a kind of symbolic weight that went beyond the surface details of carols and candlelight. As the day approached, preparations at the Abbey began in earnest. Unlike a private family gathering, the Together at Christmas service required weeks of planning, invitations sent to community heroes from across the United Kingdom, coordination with performers and musicians, careful attention to the order of the service, and as always with any royal event, careful attention to security and logistics. Kate had reportedly been involved in planning the service personally, choosing its theme for the year. Kensington Palace confirmed that this year's service would center on the theme of love and empathy, connection between people, whether within families, between friends, across communities, or in unexpected moments between strangers. For a year defined by illness, distance, and uncertainty, a theme built around love and connection felt less like a coincidence and more like a reflection of exactly what the Wales family itself had needed, and in their own private way, had been living through. The choice of theme was Kate's, but its resonance touched the entire family, William included. He had spent the year in a role that rarely gets discussed in royal commentary, not the prince carrying out official duties, but the husband and father holding a household together while his wife fought for her health and his children tried to make sense of a frightening, uncertain year. In the days before the service, royal watchers speculated about who might attend. Kate's public projects often drew a wide circle of supporters, from charity workers to celebrities who admired her work. This year would be no different, with actors, musicians, and public figures expected among the invited guests, alongside the ordinary people from communities across Britain who were being honored for their acts of kindness. But for once, the attention was not really on the celebrity guest list. It was on one simple question. Would Kate really be there in person with her whole family after everything the year had brought? The answer came on the afternoon of December 6th, when black cars began arriving at Westminster Abbey, and the doors of one of them opened to reveal a family the public had waited nearly a year to see together again. What followed was not a dramatic scene, not a moment scripted for maximum emotional impact. It was something quieter and, in its own way, more powerful, an ordinary family walking into a church on a winter evening, doing something they had done many times before, except this time, everyone watching understood exactly what it had taken to get there. A year of hospital visits and chemotherapy sessions. A year of children going to school without their mother waiting at the gate as often as she once had. A year of William balancing official duties with something far more personal, far heavier, far less visible to the world, being the steady presence his family needed while everything else felt uncertain. As the cars pulled up outside the Abbey, photographers who had gathered for days in anticipation of this moment readied their lenses. There had been no guarantee, right up until the moment the doors opened, that all three children would be present. Royal appearances involving children are always handled with care, and plans can change quickly if a family decides, even at the last moment, that a public event is not right for their children that day. But this time, the plan held. One by one, the family stepped out, not walking in as a single unit, but arriving in a way that echoed how any large family might arrive somewhere on a busy evening, slightly separated, finding each other again at the entrance. George, 11 years old that December, walked in wearing a smart navy suit, looking more like a young man than the small boy the public remembered from his early childhood appearances. Charlotte, 9, wore a matching navy outfit that coordinated with her brothers, her hair styled simply, her expression a careful mixture of composure and quiet curiosity as she took in the crowd of photographers and onlookers gathered outside the abbey. Louis VI, the youngest, walked close to his parents, still young enough that the noise and attention of a public event could feel overwhelming, but old enough now to understand, in his own way, that this evening mattered. And then there was Kate. She arrived in a red coat, accented with a black bow, paired with black boots, a striking, festive look that stood out immediately against the gray December evening and the pale stone of the abbey behind her. It was the kind of outfit that would ordinarily be discussed simply for its style, the way royal fashion often is. But this time, what people noticed first was not the color of the coat or the cut of the fabric. It was her face. After a year defined by uncertainty, here she was, smiling, present, walking toward the same church where she had once walked down the aisle in white. William walked beside her, dressed simply in a dark suit, no elaborate ceremonial dress, no formal royal regalia, just a husband and father dressed for a Friday evening service standing beside his family. Those who study royal body language for a living noted small things. How close he stayed to Kate as they approached the entrance, how he paused to let the children catch up, how his attention moved constantly between his wife and his 3 children as they navigated the crowd, the cameras, the noise. For a family that had spent much of the year deliberately staying out of the public eye, walking into Westminster Abbey that evening was not a small thing. It was, in its own quiet way, an act of trust. Trust that the public would understand the significance of the moment without needing it explained. Trust that their children could handle a large, camera-filled event after a year of trying to keep them shielded from exactly that kind of attention. And trust, perhaps most of all, that Kate herself was ready. Inside the Abbey, more than 1,000 guests were already gathered, filling the ancient stone hall with quiet conversation and the soft rustle of coats being removed as people settled into their seats. Among them were the community heroes the service had been designed to honor, nurses who had gone far beyond their job descriptions, volunteers who had spent years supporting isolated elderly neighbors, ordinary people whose quiet kindness rarely made headlines but whose impact on the people around them had been enormous. There were also recognizable faces from the world of entertainment and the arts, drawn to support Kate's project, alongside members of the wider royal family who had come to show their own support for Kate's return to public life. As the Wales family made their way toward their seats, the atmosphere inside the Abbey shifted subtly. This was not, technically, the most important royal event of the year in terms of ceremonial rank. It was not a coronation, not a state funeral, not a wedding. And yet, for those in attendance, the simple sight of Kate walking down that aisle, alive, present, smiling, surrounded by her husband and children, carried an emotional weight that few other royal events that year had matched. The lights inside the Abbey had been arranged carefully, warm and low, designed to create the kind of soft, candlelit atmosphere that a Christmas carol service calls for. Tall church candles lined the aisles, their flames flickering gently as guests took their seats. Christmas trees, decorated simply in white and gold, stood near the altar. It was, in every visible way, a scene built around warmth, a deliberate contrast to the coldness of the winter evening outside, and perhaps, in its quiet symbolism, a contrast to the difficulty of the year the family had just come through. As the family settled into their places near the front of the Abbey, close to where the service would be led, the moment that so many had been waiting nearly a year to witness had finally, quietly arrived. Kate was home, in the church that had once witnessed her wedding, surrounded by the same 3 children she had spent the hardest year of her life trying to protect, with William beside her, steady, present, and quietly holding the whole moment together. The service itself was due to begin shortly, but even before a single carol had been sung, before a single reading had been given, the evening had already delivered its most powerful moment. The simple, undeniable fact that the Wales family, all 5 of them, were together again, in public, for the first time in the hardest year they had ever faced. Inside Westminster Abbey, the Together at Christmas service was about to begin, and for a family that had spent much of the year trying to protect its most private moments from public view, the next hour would be lived almost entirely in front of the world. What happened during that hour would not involve any dramatic revelation or hidden secret. It would involve something far simpler, and in many ways far more meaningful. A family sitting together, listening, singing, and quietly supporting one another through an event built entirely around the idea of love shown in ordinary ways. The service had been designed around a theme chosen carefully for the year: love and empathy, expressed not through grand gestures but through everyday human connection. Kensington Palace had explained that the service would focus on the different forms that love takes: love within families, love between friends, love shown across entire communities, and even the quiet, powerful love that can pass between complete strangers in a single moment of kindness. For a family that had spent the year leaning on exactly these kinds of connections: quiet support from friends, unseen kindness from medical staff, patience from a public willing to give them space and privacy during Kate's treatment, the theme was not an abstract concept chosen for its poetic value. It reflected something the family had actually lived through. As the choir's voices rose into the vast stone space of the abbey, filling it with the familiar sound of traditional carols, the congregation settled into the rhythm of the service. Readings were given by various guests throughout the evening, some by well-known public figures, others by the very community heroes the service had been built to honor. Each reading, each carol, added another layer to the evening's central message. That ordinary kindness, sustained quietly over time, deserves to be celebrated as much as any grand achievement. Throughout the service, the Wales family sat together near the front, visible to much of the congregation, and through the cameras capturing the event for later broadcast to millions of people watching from home. Kate sat beside William, with the children arranged nearby. It was during one part of the service, a moment built around the symbolic passing of candlelight from person to person representing the spread of kindness through a community, that one of the more touching details of the evening became visible. As the flame was passed along the family, Kate was seen gently helping her youngest son, Louis, manage his candle, guiding his hands carefully as the small flame passed from hers to his. It was a small, ordinary parental gesture, the kind any mother might make with a 6-year-old handling an open flame in a crowded room. But set against the backdrop of the year the family had just lived through, even this small moment carried extra meaning. Here was Kate, only months removed from finishing chemotherapy, sitting in the church of her own wedding, guiding her youngest child's hand as they took part together in a ceremony about the passing on of love and light. Nearby, George and Charlotte sat attentively, following the order of service, standing for hymns, sitting for readings, behaving with the kind of composed patience that comes from years of quiet preparation for public events, even for children so young. Charlotte, in particular, had begun to show a noticeable growth in confidence during her public appearances over the preceding year. Where earlier appearances had sometimes shown a slightly shy, uncertain 9-year-old peeking out from behind a parent's coat, this evening she carried herself with more composure, more presence, more willingness to be seen. It was a small, gradual change, the kind that comes naturally as a child grows older. But it was also, in its own way, a reflection of a young girl who had spent the past year watching her mother face something frightening with quiet strength, and who seemed, in her own small way, to be absorbing some of that same steadiness. William, throughout the service, remained a quiet, constant presence beside his family. Royal engagements rarely allow much room for visible emotion, and William, like most senior royals, had long ago learned to carry himself with practiced composure in public settings. But those watching closely throughout the evening noted the small, repeated gestures that filled the hour. A hand resting briefly on Kate's shoulder during a particularly moving reading, a glance exchanged with Charlotte as she stood for a hymn, a brief word to Louis as the youngest child's attention began, understandably, to wander during the longer stretches of the service. None of these moments were dramatic. None were meant to be noticed at all. But collectively, they painted a picture of a father and husband who, throughout the most difficult year of his family's life, had learned to offer support not through big speeches or public statements, but through this kind of constant, quiet presence. This was, in many ways, the real story of William's role during Kate's illness, not a single defining moment of heroism, but a year-long pattern of steady, unglamorous support. While Kate had been the one facing the physical and emotional weight of a cancer diagnosis, William had carried his own version of the burden, managing his official duties while shielding his children from unnecessary public exposure, making decisions about which engagements the family could safely take on and which needed to be quietly canceled, and simply being present, again and again, in the ordinary moments that make up a family's life during a health crisis. The carol service did not create this pattern. It simply made it visible for one evening, to a public that had spent the year largely in the dark about what was really happening inside the family's home. As the service continued, several of the community heroes being honored that evening were invited to share brief accounts of the kindness they had shown to others. A volunteer who had spent years supporting a neighbor through a difficult illness. A teacher who had gone far beyond her role to support struggling students. A stranger who had once offered simple, unexpected comfort to someone going through a crisis. Listening to these accounts, sitting in the pews of the Abbey where their own most private year had so recently unfolded, the Wales family were, in effect, hearing echoes of their own experience reflected back at them, dressed in different names and different circumstances, but built from the same basic material, people showing up for one another when it mattered most. It would be easy to read too much into these parallels, to suggest that the family sat there consciously connecting each story to their own year. What can be said with more confidence is that the choice of theme and the emotional tone of the evening created an atmosphere in which such reflections were, if not explicitly stated, certainly invited. Kate herself had chosen this theme. She had spent a year on the receiving end of exactly the kind of quiet kindness the service was built to honor from medical staff, from friends, from a public that had, for the most part, respected her family's need for privacy during her treatment. Hosting a service built around gratitude for that kind of kindness was, in its own way, Kate's way of returning the message the year had taught her, back out into the world. As the hour-long service moved toward its conclusion, the choir led the congregation through a final series of carols, the Abbey filling once more with layered voices and the deep, resonant sound of the church organ. Outside, the December evening had turned fully dark, the temperature dropping further, but inside, wrapped in candlelight and the warmth of over 1,000 gathered guests, the atmosphere remained soft, warm, deliberately built around comfort rather than ceremony. Near the end of the service, as is traditional for the Together at Christmas event, a final blessing was given, sending the congregation out into the cold December night carrying with them the evening's central message. That love, shown consistently and often quietly, is what holds families and communities together through their hardest years. For the guests gathered that evening, the message was a meaningful close to a moving service. For the Wales family sitting near the front, it may have carried an even more personal resonance. A message that described, almost exactly, the year they had just lived through as a family, and the quiet role each of them, William included, had played in getting through it together. As the final carol faded and the congregation began to rise, preparing to file out of the Abbey into the winter night, the Wales family remained together near the front, a small unit within the much larger crowd. 5 people who had spent a year mostly hidden from public view, now standing together in one of the most historic and heavily photographed buildings in the world. The hardest part of their year was, by this point, behind them. What remained, visible to everyone watching, was simply a family, intact, present, and quietly leaning on one another as they always had, just, for once, in full view of the world that had been waiting to see them again. As the service drew to its close, and the congregation began making their way out of Westminster Abbey into the cold December night, the real significance of the evening was only just beginning to settle in, not just for the family at the center of it, but for the millions of people who would encounter this moment in the days and weeks that followed, through photographs, video clips, and news coverage that stretched far beyond the borders of the United Kingdom. Outside the Abbey, as guests departed into the night air, a small crowd of well-wishers had gathered along the barriers, hoping for a glimpse of the family as they left. Kate, William, and their children were seen briefly acknowledging the waiting crowd before making their way to their cars, the same quiet, practiced choreography of departure that follows every major royal event. But this time, even that simple, familiar routine carried extra weight. A year earlier, no one could have said with certainty that this moment, Kate stepping out of Westminster Abbey in good health, surrounded by her husband and all 3 of her children, would happen at all. In the days following the service, the footage and photographs from the evening were shared widely, not just by news outlets covering royal affairs, but by the Wales family's own official channels. Kensington Palace released behind-the-scenes footage from the evening on the family's Instagram account, showing quieter, more candid moments from before and during the service, glimpses of the children walking together, small unscripted interactions between family members, the kind of footage that royal watchers often value even more than the formal, posed photographs from an event. The caption accompanying the video framed the evening simply, as a night spent surrounded by people who make a genuine difference in the lives of others, and as a night dedicated to celebrating the kind of everyday love that had defined the service's theme. For a family that, throughout the year, had shared very little of its private life beyond a handful of carefully worded video statements about Kate's health, this decision to share behind-the-scenes footage of the carol service stood out. It suggested a family that, having weathered the hardest part of a health crisis, was beginning to feel more comfortable stepping back into a slightly more visible version of public life. Not sharing everything, certainly, but sharing enough to let the public witness some of the warmth and normalcy that had continued, quietly, even during the most difficult months. News coverage of the event, both in Britain and internationally, focused heavily on Kate's appearance and her visible well-being, understandably so, given how central her health had been to the year's biggest royal story. But alongside that coverage, a quieter narrative also emerged, one focused less on Kate herself and more on the family as a whole, on how George, Charlotte, and Louis had grown visibly over the course of a difficult year, on how William had carried himself throughout the evening, attentive and present beside his wife and children, and on what the entire scene suggested about how the family had chosen to face its hardest year. Not by disappearing entirely, not by performing strength for the cameras, but by quietly supporting one another through it, in private, and only stepping back into public view when they were genuinely ready to do so. It is worth pausing here to consider what this particular evening reveals about William's role within his family, especially during a year defined so heavily by his wife's illness. Public attention, understandably, had focused overwhelmingly on Kate throughout the year, her diagnosis, her treatment, her recovery, her gradual return to public duties. William's role, by comparison, had received far less scrutiny, partly by design. Royal communications throughout the year had been carefully managed to protect the family's privacy, and William himself had continued his own public duties with minimal public comment on his wife's condition, beyond the family's official statements. But the carol service offered a rare, visible window into what that year had likely looked like from William's side of it. Behind every public statement about Kate's treatment, there had been a husband managing his own fear and uncertainty while trying to remain a stable, reassuring presence for 3 children who were, in their own ways, also processing a frightening year. Behind every quiet school run and every canceled public engagement, there had been decisions made about how much to shield the children from, how much normalcy could realistically be preserved, and how to balance official royal duties with the very unofficial, very human job of holding a family together during a crisis. None of this had been discussed explicitly by the family in public. Royal families, and the Wales family in particular, tend to communicate through carefully chosen public appearances rather than detailed personal statements, letting moments like the carol service speak for themselves rather than explaining their significance directly. But for those willing to read the small details of the evening carefully, the hand on Kate's shoulder, the glance exchanged with Charlotte, the patient attention given to Louis throughout a long service, the message was there all the same. A father and husband who had spent a year showing up, consistently and quietly, for the people who needed him most. In the weeks that followed, as the royal carols, Together at Christmas, broadcast aired on television on Christmas Eve. As it had every year since Kate first created the tradition, the full service reached an even wider audience than the guests who had attended in person. Viewers across the country tuned in to watch the full hour-long broadcast, complete with the carols, the readings, the stories of the community heroes being honored, and woven throughout glimpses of the Wales family sitting together near the front of the Abbey. For many watching at home, it was their first real extended look at the family since the difficult year had begun, and for a great many of them, it offered a kind of quiet reassurance. Whatever the year had held, the family had come through it together, and the bonds between them, visible in every small gesture captured on camera, remained as strong as ever. Looking back on the evening now, it stands as one of the most quietly significant moments of that entire difficult year, not because of any single dramatic event, but because of everything it represented simply by happening at all. A princess who had spent months fighting cancer, choosing to return to public life through a project she had built herself, one dedicated to celebrating exactly the kind of quiet, everyday kindness that had helped carry her own family through its hardest months. 3 children, growing more composed and confident with each public appearance, clearly shaped by a year that had asked more of them than most children their age are ever asked to give. And a husband and father who, without ever needing to make a public statement about it, had spent the year doing what steady, reliable people so often do during a family crisis. Showing up, again and again, in the ordinary moments that rarely make headlines, but that quietly hold everything together. In the end, the story of the Together at Christmas service in December 2024 is not a story about a single defining moment. It is a story about the quiet accumulation of small, steady acts of love and support, carried out over the course of a genuinely difficult year, culminating in one evening where a family, at last, could stand together in public and simply be present with one another again. For Charlotte, still young, still growing into her own sense of composure and confidence, it was one more step in a childhood spent partly in the public eye, and partly, thankfully, protected from it by parents who worked hard, in ways large and small, to give her both safety and normalcy during the hardest year her family had faced. And for William, it was one more chapter in a role he had played all year, largely out of view. Not the dramatic hero of a single rescuing moment, but the steady, constant presence his family had leaned on throughout, standing quietly beside them, exactly when and where they needed him most.